everyone. Today we'll be covering how to implement your own custom human workflows, as well as a business rule engine, by integrating MuleSoft with your organization's messaging platform. My name is Connor Fitzgerald. I'm a lead consultant at Big Compass. I'm also a MuleSoft mentor, and I'm based down in Atlanta, Georgia. The topics we'll be focusing on today are business rule engines and human workflows. So what exactly is a rule engine and how can it be useful to us? Well, the traditional approach is to embed business logic directly within the source code. The issue here is that business requirements and rules are dynamic. A lot of times these will change multiple times throughout the lifetime of an API. With the power of a rule engine, this allows non-technical and technical users to modify the runtime logic without digging into the underlying code, nor requiring a redeployment of the application. For human workflows, these come into play whenever you have a use case that may require a actual human interaction or intervention. This could be a approval of a certain request. So what do we mean by human interface? By this we mean how can we allow humans to integrate and interact with our application network in a way that is friendly to non-technical users. So what does the current architecture for most of our organizations look like? Well, for human workflows, a lot of times we'll have a decoupled approach. So the alert may be generated in ServiceNow, but then to actually approve or deny or service that request, you may need to use another tool or platform such as Postman. Now, full disclosure, there is a way to configure all of this within ServiceNow so that you are presented with the request and are able to service it directly within ServiceNow, but that requires ServiceNow expertise to configure that workflow, and you may need to train your business teams on how to use ServiceNow to accomplish that. And not to mention, whether it's a decoupled or a coupled approach, it adds yet another platform to monitor. So if you're using ServiceNow or emails, you're constantly having to check these for approval requests. And then most common approach for rules engine currently, especially with MuleSoft integrations, is just that we don't have one. Developers will create these application networks and APIs for the business team, and we like to think that it's their product, that we're turning it over to them. But at the end of the day, an application network is still just a black box to the business team. Any changes they need to make need to go through the developer. They still hold the keys or are the gatekeeper to the black box. So now that we've covered what most environments look like conventionally, let's see how it looks in practice. So the result of this, where you do not have a human interface, you're unable to implement a business rule engine or even a human workflow. Well, from the developer's perspective, they are constantly bombarded with these change requests. And this takes time away from the developer to work on their current use case, and also creates delays on the business side, where many of these changes at first glance should only take a couple hours to make. But we see delays of weeks and even months in some cases because the request has to go from the business user to the developer. They have to assess and plan when they can take on the effort. And then even when they are able to get through these requests, they may find that there's a whole nother list of requests that came through business users using the proper change request channels. So they may have a whole nother set of ServiceNow tickets to account for. Now, there are existing solutions to tackle this problem, but the issue with those is that a lot of times they're overkill. If you have a very simple use case, such as a manual human approval, or the ability to modify business rules at runtime, well, you don't want to purchase, provision, and maintain an entire business process engine or workflow engine just to satisfy low complexity use cases. There has to be a way that we can account for these given the tools and resources that we have currently. So what exactly we need is a user-friendly interface, and by user-friendly I specifically mean easy to use for non-technical personnel. So we want to abstract as much as the underlying complexities away as possible. And this is going to enable business users to receive these requests, interpret them, interact, and even request more information on them. And Slack is a perfect medium to create this portal that's going to enable our business users to implement human workflows through Slack. And one of the reasons Slack is such a great option for this is because it's already so familiar to the business team. So if your organization is already using something like Slack or Teams for all day-to-day communication, well, there's very little onboarding or training needing because they're already quite familiar with the platform. But also, it's centralized, so the entire team can see the channel where business users are interacting with the application network. We can trace who has made changes. We can even discuss these changes that we're making directly in line with how we're communicating with the application network. And then for the business rule engine, our goal is to empower the business teams. We want them to be self-sufficient. We want them to have the ability to modify business rules and test those without having to go through a developer for every single one of these changes. So the goal here is to maximize this green line where the business teams are making their own changes, and then minimize this yellow line where they're having to route every change request to the developer, which again is taking time away from both the business team and the development teams. Now, one way we can accomplish this is by using the Slack connector. And I'm specifically saying one way because this is not, it's not that this can only be accomplished on Slack. If your organization is using Teams or Google Chat, either one you go with, you can implement exactly what we're going to cover in the demo here. That's not to say that the Slack connector is not very well supported and has a long list of supported operations. So we're able to read and write messages from both group channels and private direct messages. We can start and stop calls. We can upload and download files, interact with Slack bots. We can retrieve the user status to see if they are out of office or on Do Not Disturb. And we can even create reminders for those users. And then I wanted to touch on the commands and webhooks feature. So these are features that would be configured within Slack itself, and they can be used to make your user experience even that much better. So by leveraging those in conjunction with your MuleSoft application, you can create a very rich and streamlined user interface. Now, one thing that the Slack connector also provides is the ability to use either application or user permissions. Now, one hesitation with many security teams when you are implementing with a messaging platform is that everyone in your organization, again, is using this to communicate. So there's a significant risk of security here and access control. But if you're using user permissions, basically what you're saying is the application can authenticate on behalf of a user and has these permissions available. However, the effective permissions are the least privileged intersection of the permissions that that user already has and what the application is allowed to do. And so what this facilitates is the ability to define and control all access and permissions within Slack itself, and they can be assigned to the same user accounts that you're already using. And it allows you to not grant global access. In the beginning days of integrating with Teams, if you were going to authenticate on behalf of an application service account, well then the permissions are not granular at all. They're global. So the application either can read all chats or it can read none of them. But with Slack, you have the ability to either authenticate on behalf of an application itself and restrict those permission scopes, or again use the least privileged intersection of the user that the application authenticated on behalf of. Now, there is a prerequisite step for using the Slack connector, and that is configuring and installing a Slack app. To do that, you simply go to api.slack.com, and there's a very easy interface that walks you through the creation of that. Through this interface, you're able to define the features, functionality, and most importantly, the permissions that your application will have. And again, those permissions are divided between what the application is able to do when it authenticates on behalf of itself, as well as when it authenticates on behalf of a specific user account. And that allows us to keep the access control and permissions. That is all configured on the Slack side when we use delegated or on behalf of. There's no global access or access control that needs to be enforced within the MuleSoft implementation. By creating a Slack app, you are generating the application's client ID and client secret, and that is used in the OAuth 2.0 dance that we'll cover in the next slide. So with the OAuth 2.0 dance, you must authorize or consent to the permissions. Again, the permissions are either what the application can do when it authenticates on behalf of itself or a user account. When you navigate to the authorization URL, and this is configured at the same time that you are configuring the Slack app, so you can provide this authorization endpoint as well as the credentials to any of your API consumers. When they navigate there, they are presented with the list of permissions that will be allowed, and once they allow those, they are automatically redirected to their callback URL. And when they are redirected to the callback URL, a authorization code is sent. This authorization code is temporary, but can be exchanged for a permanent access token. I'd like to highlight that these access tokens do not expire by default, but they can be configured to expire. Now, one of the great parts about the Slack connector is that it's able to autonomously exchange this authorization code for a permanent access token. So all you have to do is configure your callback URL within the Slack connector. So what we see here on the right is our callback URL configuration and listener. So this listener behind the scenes is just waiting to receive authorization codes, and then autonomously it's going to exchange that authorization code for a permanent access token and store it in an object store. Now, because we're able to define this object store as well, you can configure it as persistent so that you do not have to execute this OAuth dance and consent workflow every time. It can be a one-time thing. On the left side here, we see the consent form. So the user or admin is presented with the permissions that will be used by the application, either when authenticating on behalf of itself or a user. And then as soon as you click allow, that temporary authorization code is generated and you're redirected to your callback URL, which will be the listener. And within the Slack app configuration, you're able to specify multiple callback URLs, so you can have a local host callback for local development, obviously, and then you can also add in each of your Cloud Hub URLs. Now, getting into our demo, part one here, we're going to cover human workflows. Let's say we have a requirement that we have a charges API. So that API is going to receive customer account charges, and then there's a business requirement that any charge over, let's say, $5,000 must have a manual human approval before the charge can be executed. So how can we interface with humans? With MuleSoft, we think of autonomous integrations. They should work behind the scenes without interaction. But now we have a use case that we do need to leverage human intervention in certain situations. And we can easily accomplish that using Slack as our interface. Now, getting into the demo, here we can see our API that's going to receive the account charges. We'll first send one for $4,000, which again is below the $5,000 threshold, so we should see this one go straight through immediately. And now let's send one also above the threshold. So if we come over to Slack, we see the manual approval request for our $6,000 charge. And for the sake of the demo, any charge that does go through, we go ahead and create an alert in this completed charges channel, just to make it easier to see when they go through. So now we can simply approve this request. And in just a second, we should see that come through as a completed charge, which we do, and it is a $6,000 amount. And let's say there's also a requirement where we want to enable our business users to check the status of any one of these requests. So let's say command so for 001, we see that it was completed. Whoops. As well as 002. Now, our goal here is to create an interface that business users can use. And we have to remember that they're not technical. So you can make this implementation as robust or bulletproof as you want. So let's say we have a business user that makes a slight change and says retrieve instead of get. Well, we can account for that and almost implement some sort of natural language processor to interpret retrieve just the way it would interpret get. And then if we don't want to make it as robust, we can simply, well, let's go ahead and grab this. Respond with hints or pointers if they are issuing invalid commands. And so here we said please get instead of get, and the API is going to respond with the correct syntax for the commands. And notice that anything with this command prefix, the system API is interpreting as a command. It knows that the business user is requesting some sort of action. But the beauty here is that anything without the prefix is ignored by the system API. So business users are able to enter this channel and interact with the application network or APIs, but then they can also discuss with each other and say, let's say, should we and in real time, just seeing records process or be approved, they can discuss certain things about the use case at hand. Now, getting into the benefits of a human workflow engine via Slack, one of the most predominant ones is that I believe we all can agree that whether we're using Slack or Teams, we're a bit more responsive or available on a message platform. So an enterprise solution such as ServiceNow can be great for some organizations, but let's say there's a holiday or a weekend. It's much easier to see and acknowledge a Slack notification versus a ServiceNow ticket. A lot of times we say we're checking email, but you don't say you're checking Slack. It's almost like it's always there. And with the Slack interface, we're very easily able to centralize and keep the alert and as well as the resolution of that right in the same place, and it's visible across the organization. So it's an intrinsic auditing, basically. Whoever approves the request, they had to do so as a user of Slack. And so it's easy to trace through and see who approved the request or who made the changes. And again, Slack is already going to be familiar to your business users if that's what your organization is already using to communicate. And then one enhancement we can make to this is automated escalation that is dynamic and based on user availability. So let's say we have a approval request, but the users that we need to approve are all out of office or in a meeting at the time. Well, we can dynamically route that to another team or contact for approval. Now for part 2 of the demo, we're going to be covering our business rule engine implementation. Now again, the motivation here is to allow the business teams to be a bit more self-sufficient. We're going to save times for both IT and business personnel because they are no longer reliant or waiting on one another. The stakeholders are finally going to have control. They're going to be able to make changes over their integrations without relying on the developer every step of the way. So getting into the demo, like we mentioned, we could have a discussion about raising the threshold, but what we could go even further is provide a command to increase the threshold. Let's say we agree to increase it to 10,000. So again, traditionally this would be some sort of formal change request. The developers would have to scope the level of effort and then add it to the backlog and plan a cycle for when they can account for the change. But now, through the power of a pseudo business rule engine via Slack, we're enabling the business user to make this change themselves. And we can also allow them to make this change in a lower environment if they want to test it first. And we'll give them a confirmation when it's applied. So we saw that the 6,000 request came through with a approval. Now let's send a $9,000 request. And because this is below the new $10,000 limit, we do see that it came right through. And now we'll send one slightly above the new limit. And that one did generate an approval request. So again, we can retrieve the status of any of these. And for account 004, we should see that it's pending approval. Now let's say we get distracted and we want to run a new scheduled job. Well, we can have a command for that as well, where you are able to invoke a process with a custom filter criteria. And so now we've just seen a non-technical business user modify conditional logic and also invoke a process with a custom filter. And let's say we don't like this syntax where it's command colon. There may be some reason that it doesn't work for the business team. Well, we can completely change the syntax where instead of the system API searching for this command prefix, we can just say anything that's within a code block or a code snippet should be interpreted as a command for the Slack system API. And then we're going to have the exact same functionality of this command, just a different syntax. And now another benefit and a bit of a nuisance to developers is change requests for minor mapping changes. Let's say a business user realizes that the system sending requests to the charges API for some reason needs a timestamp in the response, let's say. So we can also include a command to add a mapping or modify a mapping, let's say. And what we can create or implement, and this can be implemented either within Slack itself through the workflow configuration, or keep all the logic in the MuleSoft System API, but we can implement this interactive workflow where the business user is making a very low-level technical change to the integration without even knowing that they're modifying code. So we're going to add a mapping. We're going to change the charges interface. We're going to modify the response. Now, there is some risk here because now you are enabling your business users to modify the API specification. So they're responsible for being aware of any downstream changes or consuming systems that this could affect. But what we did here is create the interactive workflow where they're able to add in or modify or even remove a new mapping. So we have the syntax where we apply the field name, let's call this timestamp, and then colon the value. Now, another common issue is that business users know canonical names or plain text names. So what is current time to them is the now data we've operated to a MuleSoft developer. So we can have a lookup behind the scenes so business users are able to use the syntax and wording that they're familiar with, and then behind the scenes we can run the lookups to translate this to the actual technical verbiage. So let's say instead of what would be employee status to a business user, we could convert that to the actual API field name, which might be an EMP status. Again, we can have that lookup behind the scenes. And that's exactly what we're doing with current time here. So the implementation is smart enough to know that when a business user says current time, they really mean now. So we're going to confirm this change. And then let's go ahead, now that this has been acknowledged, let's verify that change. So we see that the response object does not have a timestamp in there. But if we send this new request, we are now receiving a timestamp. And so this was an enhancement or a change that was made by a business user without even interacting with a developer. And then if you noticed, we have a new message in this approval escalations. And that's because this charge up here, the original one for 004, exceeded the expiration interval. So we can have a preset window where if no one acknowledges by either approving or denying this request, we can automatically escalate this to a different channel where it would raise some more attention and can be serviced. So let's go ahead and approve that one. Again, approvals are as simple as adding a reaction. We'll approve this one as well. Let's get the status of 004 just to make sure that it did come through. You see that was completed. So that concludes part 2 of the demo. But I did want to cover these interactive components and workflow configurations because I think that these could be leveraged to make the implementation that much better. So if we look at the interactivity block kit, so this is a feature within Slack where you're able to create these basically interactive forms. So you could have a more user-friendly and visually appealing approval and reject process rather than just applying a reaction to the message. And these buttons could call different web hooks that trigger different workflows within MuleSoft application network. And then with these drop downs and text menus, one possibility is that any given ETL process is really just a source system, a target system, and then a set of mappings and transformations. Well, you can configure an interactive workflow like this that will allow business teams to create, configure, and schedule their own ETL processes without relying on a developer to make those changes. And same thing can be true with slash commands. So this allows you to shift some of the business logic around your Slack integration into Slack itself. So one disadvantage of the current implementation is that we have to poll the Slack channels for new messages. But with the use of slash commands, these can send out a request. So your request URL would be your system API, and that way we're not polling the application, we're not polling the Slack channel periodically or on a fixed frequency. We are instead only listening for requests whenever these slash commands are executed. Now, what are some of the benefits of implementing your own business rule engine via Slack? Again, I cannot reiterate enough the time savings. So it's a pain point for both IT development teams and the business teams. No one wants to rely on another person. If we can cut out a middleman, we would love to. So it just makes sense to empower the business team to make their own changes. And it takes a little bit of time up front to configure all of this, but then the business team no longer relies on the development, or relies on the developers to make these changes, and that saves a ton of time for the developers to focus on their current use cases rather than constantly making changes to previous integrations. And the beauty is that Slack is so easy to use, and the solution can really be as user-friendly or robust as you would like to make it. And again, we have several integration patterns. Through the use of those slash commands, we can have a push to the system API, or we can stick with what we have. We are constantly polling the channel for new messages or reactions to those messages. Now, again, you can do all this in an enterprise solution rules engine. It's just that that's going to cost more money to set up and purchase. There's probably going to be more overhead and configuration up front. And you're overkilling the situation. Such a simple rule. We already saw how we were able to implement conditional logic changes. We can retrieve statuses. We can trigger job processes and even modify mappings just with a few Slack commands. And I'd like to reiterate again that this is not specific to Slack. So whether your organization uses Teams, Google Chat, or even Discord, there's most likely a MuleSoft connector for that. If not, you can even go straight to their APIs. And their APIs are all rich enough to support exactly the same workflows that we just saw in the demo, but with one of the alternative platforms. I'd like to touch a little bit more on the additional use cases or the way we can enhance these and go even further with this approach. So again, we touched on the interactive workflows in BlockKit, so that's going to allow you to create almost like forms or an interactive form where your business user can make changes to the application network. We also touched on checking for user status before sending these approval requests. So if someone is on vacation or out of office, we can route it to an alternate contact. We also have partial approvals. So what we saw in the demo was only a yes or a no, but you could have a mechanism where the business user can reply with a partial amount. So let's say the charge was requested for 10,000 and you only want to approve 5,000. You could easily do that by just responding to the message. And also passive request. So what we saw was a request that exceeded the expiration interval was escalated. Instead, we can have it autocomplete if it exceeds the expiration interval. So it's more of a, you're able to reject requests from automatically completing rather than you being the only filter that allows requests to complete that exceed the threshold, obviously. We can also create file-based integrations. So with the Slack connector, we have the ability to read and write from files in Slack. So let's say you have a job report that you need to publish after every execution. Well, that can be placed in a MuleSoft channel that the business team can then all have access to and even discuss the results of those directly in line. And let's say there's a flat file as the input to one of your interfaces. Well, having that input come from a Slack channel will allow the business users to trigger a job with the exact records that they'd like whenever they want. It can be an on-demand process where the Slack system API is simply waiting on new files to be added to that channel. And one thing I've experienced is a bit of pushback for REST clients. So let's say the job process where we invoked processing of count records with a certain filter. Um, that'd be quite easy to implement and just have it be through a post command rather than a Slack message. But I've had a bit of pushback from clients in terms of using Postman or the REST client. But whereas Slack is going to be a much easier to use and familiar interface for them, and you can implement it in a way that it doesn't even feel technical to them. And additionally, this does not need to completely overhaul an existing approach. So let's say your organization is already using something like ServiceNow. This can work in conjunction with that. So your initial approval requests may still go through ServiceNow, but let's say you have an issue with visibility into those or escalations. Well, then you can pair it with Slack so that if a ServiceNow ticket goes unaccepted for too long, well, then it can be escalated into a Slack channel where users are more available and active. And then we also touched on using those custom workflows and BlockKit to create basically a configuration-based ETL job generator. And for infrastructure monitoring, it's extremely critical that as soon as you, let's say, lose connectivity or an application goes down, you want to know about that outage or loss of connectivity as soon as possible. And again, Slack is just so available, whether it's on the weekend or early in the morning. When I get a Slack message, my computer makes a ding, my watch lights up, and my phone vibrates. It's very hard to miss a Slack message, but let's say a Cloud Hub notification or alert that may be less noticeable. And then in terms of employee onboarding, we can go either direction with this. Let's say you want to define a new employee's account in Slack first, and then have the Slack System API pull the details from Slack, and then automatically create that new employee in some of your other systems. And same can be the reverse. So let's say new hires are first added to Salesforce. You can have the Slack System API pull the details from Salesforce, and then automatically create the account in Slack. So that concludes the Meetup demo for creating a human interface using a Slack integration. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn for any questions or comment those below. Thank you very much.